All right, welcome everybody to a Career Pathways Portal training session. This particular session is focusing on employment certificates, i.e. working papers, and I-9 verification. I am your host, Damiano Massandrea, a colleague and friend over at the Brooklyn STEAM Center, bringing it to you all the latest news about CPP. Whether you are new or old to the platform or the process of work-based learning, we're excited to have you. And should you ever need any support, please feel free to reach out so that way we can get you the best, most direct information as possible. The district's turnaround time is approximately 2 school days. So sounds like to me, they're moving on the up and up. For our agenda today, and there will of course be visuals, we're going to do a little bit on what are employment certificates, why do we call them working papers, and what are the details that go into those. And then we're also going to discuss the infamous I-9 protocol, which is something that young people must do in order for them to be considered for wage-based or hourly paid internship opportunities. And so that's where we're going to start our focus for today. So to begin with a visual that I particularly like, on your screen, you should now see a picture of 3 cards. These cards are the documents that we refer to as employment certificates. They are documents that are generated and created by the state education department and are documents that need to be used by any youth under the age of 18. This is from the Department of Labor, specifically looking at the employment of minors. Minor, of course, in this situation, again, meaning those below the age of 18. And although there are many different types of these employment certificates, the ones that you as a work-based learning coordinator or school designee that will more than often see are going to be these green and blue cards. The blue card is a non-factory employment certificate, and it's specifically for 14 and 15-year-olds. In general, if you're a 14 or 15-year-old scholar, you qualify for this blue card. And we'll go into how do young people actually get this particular document. But right now, I'm just going to break down the differences between the two. So general 14, 15-year-olds, we got the blue card. And then for 16 and 17-year-olds, that general employment certificate is going to be green. There are, like I mentioned earlier, a few different other versions, such as for child performers or for specific titles that are recognized separately in the Department of Labor. But the last major one that, to be quite honest with you, you'll probably never see, but maybe is this orange salmon-y color card. That card is only for youth under the age of 18 who are 16 or 17 years old that are no longer enrolled in school. And if that's the case, of course, that means we wouldn't be processing them in the Career Pathways portal. But that document allows a 16 and 17-year-old to essentially qualify for full-time employment. It's their workers' authorization card saying, hey, boss, hey, employer, I can work for you full-time. I'm not restricted by the standard rules of, no more than X hours a week or these hours of work for a minor because I have this card and I'm no longer in school, which mainly or usually occurs when a young person graduates early from school. But of course, it could also pertain to a youth who's withdrawn from compulsory education, which is also a potential option for certain types of students based on their own status and the things they want to do. But let's focus our attention on what we do need. And that is, how do young people get these working papers? If we look at the chancellor's regulation on it, which is a further, more stringent version of the state education department guidelines, every school that offers services to young people in the age range that these cards are applicable to must offer the ability for young people to obtain working papers. So in many cases, this would mean you, the high school, and in some cases, certain middle schools have the ability to issue employment certificates. Now that answers the question of where, and we've already answered the question of what these things are, But the other thing is, who do we go to in order to get these cards? And that will depend on who your principal has designated as the point person for administering these employment certificates to youth. In many cases and scenarios, your school's principal may have opted for the selection of a work-based learning coordinator who does receive training on how to issue these. But it can also be a community associate, a school aide, and very popularly, school counselors. And depending on the size of your school, you may also find that there is more than one individual who will process the documentation for these cards. So if that's the who, the next one, of course, will be the when. When can young people get these cards and do the application? Well, that's a two-sided story. The first one we have to look at is, of course, the youth's age. So the scholar or the student needs to be of age to qualify for these cards. So if they're aiming to get the blue card, they have to be 14 or 15 years old. And if they're looking for the green card, they're 16 or 17 years old. In the other side of the coin, about when young people can actually submit their application, typically for most schools, that's going to be September to June. And youth might have a question of, well, where do I go if my school is closed? Technically, youth can go to any school, but during periods of vacation or rest, as the state so eloquently writes it, school students may also go to community district offices to speak with those specific liaisons there who are also able to issue the card. So that means if you have youth that aren't in the public school system, perhaps they're in charter or externally, and their residents, they can of course also apply at the community district office. So if we look at that, we now know the who, what, when, where, but now we have to do the how. Because the why is all built on getting I-9 verified, of course, as this is a prerequisite for it. The how can be answered in a few different ways. One of the things we could do is go on the state education department and look up the application for it. That particular document is called the AT-17. What I just Googled for all of you is NYSED, the New York State Education Department, AT-17. And it's the first link that pops up. This document technically does explain to youth and their families everything they need to know, and so does the processor, whoever creates the card needs to know on this one document. Unfortunately, this is not a very young person friendly document. I'm sure the state education department has revised it slowly to ensure that it is more friendly to our youth's audience. But of course, this document can look very scary. The short end of the story is that students need three things to get their working papers. They need this particular application, which I'll break down in a few moments. They need a certificate of fitness, which we'll describe after, and some evidence of age. Again, all of this is here on that document, but hearing it just as a three-part list kind of makes it a little bit easier for us. All of the rules and regulations that aren't on page 1 have been also highlighted on page 2. It really breaks down for youth what they need to know, but also for a processor, whether that's going to be you or somebody else from the school, so that they know exactly what they're doing. For the purposes of being able to follow along, I'm going to both drop this link in the chat and zoom in. And we're just going to take a look into how you would ask a student to fill this out, and also a particular method that we use at our particular school to issue these. Before I continue on, though, I have a great question from Helen in the chat. She's asking about the orange salmon color card. That is the AT-20, in which the green and blue cards respectively are the AT-19 and AT-18. If you are trying to order these cards, your procurement specialist or your purchasing secretary at your school should be able to use the information we've described to be able to purchase that item through FAMIS, the DOE's purchasing system, so you don't have to go hunting for them, and you certainly wouldn't want to create your own, as these are official documents from the state of New York. Popping on back to the application here, an excellent question, Helen. Thank you very much. We can see that the first part is really the only place where a young person and their family member is actually going to do anything. And we can see in part one, it's all about parental consent. The student will identify themselves, where they live, the date of the application, and how old they are as of the date they're filling it out. And then they have to have their parents sign it. If they're unsure of which option to click here, that's something that they can ask you when they bring it in. But again, it's based on age. And so hopefully a young person can identify their own age and just be able to read these short sentences to mark off the appropriate one that they're looking for. From that point, the student needs to just bring this in and their other documentation. There's nothing else for them to fill out on this paper. However, the paper does do you the fortunate service of providing you with information for the youth in case they need to know what else to bring. And that's evidenced in part 2 and 3. Part 2 is something that the issuing official, which of course may be you, needs to fill out. And what students can provide varies. They can bring things like a birth certificate, an ID driver's license or learner's permit. Really what the state education department is looking for and what you as an issuing official would look for is just a validated form of documentation, particularly from a government source that includes the person's name and date of birth. Because what we're really trying to determine is this scholar that's applying for an employment certificate, which we call working papers, because it's a little bit more apt, is actually the age that they state they are. This space is for that issuing official to put that down and really check, like, are they the age that they say they are? My suggestion for you is that if you're going to be doing this and you don't happen to be a person in the school that has access to STARS, you may want to collaborate with somebody from that team, because you can also use a transcript or permanent record, as it's considered a government document in this case, and includes the student's full name and date of birth. And so you can use that as an alternative document as well, should a student forget any of the other documents. They only have to bring in one. And I should also be very clear that we as schools cannot dictate which document the student can bring in. They can bring in any of these, and that's fine. They can also bring in another document that might not be listed here, so long as it meets those baseline requirements of government issued, full name, date of birth. So for example, a passport, which isn't a listed option on here, could be considered valid, so long as you receive it in an appropriate picture or copy, because you do need to keep that on file with the application. Before I move on to the next part, I'm just going to call out for a brief moment something that many of you who may have done this before or have heard of it is now a common misconception. Previously, a few years ago, the state education department required that youth include their social security number on the application. And in fact, if we look at previous examples, such as for the full-time employment certificate, although rather small, there's still a line for a social security number. However, for youth to be able to get their working papers, their employment certificate, it is not a required field. Any youth, regardless of numeric status of having that number, can obtain their employment certificate so long as they provide these documents that we're describing here to get their working papers, all for the great pursuit of either getting them into a paid experience, in which I-9 verification has a prerequisite of working papers, or an alternatively unpaid experience. I'll pause there just for a moment to take Nicole's question before we drop down to the certificate of physical fitness. Nicole?
Hey, Damiano, just a quick question. So I have somebody else that does the working papers in my building. I was following what New York State was mentioning, either students bring birth certificates, state issue ID, all that good stuff. But according to the New York City website, if you look at NYC DOE, it says that a birth certificate as proof of age. It doesn't say anything else. But so the person that's doing the working papers is only taking a birth certificate. So if a student brings in an ID, she's not taking it. So I just want to clarify it. And I just want to make sure that this is something that, do we follow state or do we follow what the DOE says? I just wanted to clarify that.
That's a really good question. Of course, for legal matters, I do have to defer to the district's perspective, but from my personal and professional role as a professor who teaches this course, we defer to the state's mandate because it comes from the New York State Department of Labor.
Right.
However, if any additional details are available from the district, I definitely invite them to unmute themselves and share. Otherwise, they can investigate and get back to you. But as of my understanding, we cannot dictate, and it even says that in the regulation.
Right. That's what I wanted to make sure before I said anything else. All right. Thank you for clarifying. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Thanks.
Believe it or not, though, even with Nicole's question, the evidence of age is not the most conscientious or like the thing that really stops kids from getting their working papers. To be quite honest with you, the thing that truly stops a youth from getting their working papers is going to be this certificate of physical fitness. This is when a doctor or school or private physician or a few other medical practitioners authorize that a youth is physically capable of employment. And of course, that can have its own caveats to it. But for many youth, getting to the doctor can be a challenge, and it may be an issue to even get an appointment when it's necessary. Fortunately, so long as a student has obtained a physical in the last year, so within the last 12 months of the date of their application, the day you process it, right? A letter from the doctor, which can come in a few different forms, are acceptable. This can come from the New York State version of the certificate of fitness, which really just lists the kid's name, birth date, and their like office stamp. But it can also be a letter written on letterhead from that particular agency, or New York City has their own version of the form as well, which is a little bit more detailed. The spirit of this particular role is that we're looking for an official sign-off from a physician that has seen the student and has provided a clear contextual statement that includes that the young person named with their birth date somewhere on that document is physically fit for an employment status. If, for whatever reason, we have a youth, such as one who is disabled, perhaps physically or even mentally, the physician can still provide a certificate of physical fitness. They will just indicate, in addition to that statement of being fit, that there may be certain limitations that need to be considered when issuing them a placement in work. And that is something that they would include on that form. And it's also something that you or the issuing official would include on the top of their working papers. There's not a specific line on the paper for it. You would just write that there's a specific limitation. Now, there are additional sections on this document, specifically sections 4 and 5, but those are not typically going to be filled out by anybody. When a youth is applying for a blue or green card, it's very rare that part 4, where an employer is saying, hey, we're going to hire them and that's why they need the working papers, or that a school needs to prove that the student is beyond the requirement for compulsory education. So more often than not, these two sections will be blank. However, Just like with anything having to do with legal terminology, you should always review the documents and the procedure should you feel like a particular applicant qualifies to have this section completed. There's a few additional nuances, but this presentation is also really structured around the general student, and we can provide further commentary about meeting other youth of different needs as well. To answer the question in the chat, which says, where can we access the form to let the students know? You have a few different options. My primary recommendation, though, would be to determine at your school who is responsible for it and their method for sharing out this information, because you don't want to just give the application if they don't know where they have to bring it to or who they have to follow up with to get the card. We have the link directly to the website on the State Education Department for them to download. And that's what's in the chat and what we're looking at on the screen. But beyond that, who to hand it in to at your school and things like that are something you'll have to investigate if you're unaware of who that personnel or team of people are to be able to issue the certificates. The only other point that I'm going to share on this particular section is the last part. And this would be completed by somebody at the school that is issuing the card. They would insert their certificate number, which is a control number, as well as a few other details of like who issued the card and where. The chancellor's regulation indicates particular methodologies for labeling them. And so that's a more structured approach. That's an example of where the city department has provided a more stringent level of eyes on a particular process, which is acceptable by law. And your school may already have an established system, so you should follow through with that as well. For the purposes of a best practice, you can look at this in two different lenses. You can approach from the low-tech solution, which is, putting up on bulletin boards, giving out at the beginning of the year flyers, sharing at the parent empowerment group or parent night information about how youth can get employment certificates, or I should say, you can also go with a very high-tech solution. At the Brooklyn STEAM Center, for example, students are able to submit their documents to us digitally. They do need to still have all the proper documentation. They still need to ensure that it has actual signatures on them. But for the purposes of really giving people the most access as possible, especially since the majority of this documentation will be reviewed at home with a mom or dad or other guardian, we decided that developing a digital solution was the best way for youth to be able to send it in. It also provided us with a deeper level of control, and that's kind of what we were looking for. So I will provide this in a form version, like a printout, I should say, so that way, if you're thinking about doing something similar, you can feel empowered to do so. But what you see on the screen right now is an example of how you could potentially build a form for students to complete to upload this documentation. That way they can retain their original documents and you can have a copy of them. And again, I will include that as an attachment here in the chat box, which should be uploading in just a moment. It asks all of the same questions. It ensures that students are using their school-based accounts. It explains all of the information they have to include. And it's a little less scary than giving them right away that big document that just says, oh, fill it out. And kids, rightly so, are intimidated because it's a lot of information on a legal size paper in order for them to be able to be considered to work. I'm going to pause for a moment and determine, are there any additional clarifications or questions about working papers before we get to I-9 verification, in which working papers are a prerequisite. You need working papers as part of the journey to get I-9 verified if you're under 18. So, questions, thoughts, concerns? Okay, we'll come back to it in case you do have anything to add. From here, we're now going to move away from working papers. We are going to assume for this next section of the presentation here today that if a student is getting I-9 verified and they're under the age of 18, they've already gone through this process to get their working papers. If they haven't, you want to jump back to the first half of this presentation and get kids through that process first. But I-9 verification is specifically a legally designed process by the federal government for employers, including the New York City Department of Education, to verify the identity and the ability for a person, not just youth, to be able to be paid in the United States of America. And so for our youth, they have to go through this process underneath the umbrella of this district, this team, in order to qualify for wage-based internships. So to clarify, to be very specific, having working papers on its own is not enough for a young person to be involved in a paid internship experience. Working papers only allow a person to work. It does not confirm that they are eligible for payment. And so that alone isn't sufficient. And so it's this additional process, this next step, I like to call it level 2 of onboarding, that needs to be done before they can be considered for an experience. I-9 verification, again, only applies to internship wage-based experiences, actual work. So in the Career Pathways portal, we have 2 types of experiences. We have hourly wage-based internships where students are doing real work more often than not, 99.99%, in a place of work for an industry partner. And then we also offer stipended experiences, which we have commonly referred to in the city of New York as workplace challenges, or as the state education department would recognize as an industry-based project for work-based learning purposes. Those experiences, stipends, not actual work, collaborative, training or, project work, trying to avoid that word, project collaboration isn't the same thing as actual work. And so I-9 verification isn't required for the stipended experience type. Internships, yes, stipends, no. However, depending on the funding stream, the Career Pathways portal may require for a stipended experience, a Social Security number. Social Security numbers or an individual taxpayer identification number, an ITIN, is always a requirement for I-9 verification, which means that it's a prerequisite for an internship wage-based experience. There is a table within the Career Pathways portal handbook that breaks this down a little further. And of course, if you're ever in a place where there's some form of confusion, we can provide that clarity for you. Before I go any further, though, I'd like to pass it on to Alicia to add any additional commentary.
Sorry, Damiano. I wanted to clarify, ITIN cannot be used for internship wages, only Social Security numbers. They can be used in place of a Social Security number for workplace challenges.
Thank you for the clarification. You learn something new every day. And so to get a young person I-9 verified, they need to do a few things. The first thing they need to do is collect their documentation. And to do that, they're going to have to probably have a very adult conversation with their family at home to say, hello, I'm going to need access to these particular documents. Now, students have a few options about what they can bring. And again, just in the same process with working papers, the employer cannot dictate which documents a student brings to this particular appointment. However, there are some caveats to that. So here on the page, you'll see that we're on the official website of the federal government for I-9, and we can see that students can bring documents from one of two sections. They can bring a single document from list A, or they can bring a document from list B and C. So if they have a document from list A, such as their US passport or US passport card, they would only need to bring that in addition to their working papers and their I-9 application to get verified. However, if a student doesn't have an item from list A, they would need to bring a document from list B and C, because in this case, list B establishes the student's identity, but list C establishes can they be paid in the United States, whereas documents from list A do both. Typically, a combination of list B and C for students are something like their birth certificate and their school ID card, or their social security card and their school ID card, to make it really accessible and easily connected for students. However, when we look at things like list B, which includes things like the driver's license, and we look at items from list C, such as the social security card, there is this opportunity to mix and match. As part of that adult conversation that our youth need to have with their families, as a best practice, it would stand to reason that the person who is supporting youth in getting I-9 verified should send communication out to homes, both backpacked, phone call blast, email, to both ensure and validate the concerns that family have about these very secretive, for a right reason, documentation, but also to include them in on the process to understand what's happening. When a student has gotten their working papers, if they're under 18, has gotten these documents, they then can say, am I ready? And the problem that we run into a lot when verifying youth is that they don't check themselves before they select their appointment. And what I mean by that is we just talked about different types of documents they can bring, but they have to bring them in a very specific way. Students cannot, under any circumstance, under the given previously established protocol, provide copies, scans, or photographs of documents. Unfortunately, that is currently the process. And although investigations are underway to attain a potentially alternative direction, that is currently the system that's in place. So students cannot show the verifier on their phone a picture of their birth certificate. Mom can't email it to the verifier. The student can't have a Xerox or a photocopy of these documents in front of them. They must be the original document, because that is what's currently the precedent for legal. In addition, if a document has an expiration date, like a passport or something like certain school ID cards or a learner's permit, if that document is expired, it is also not accepted as a document for questions to get verified. So, I can put this on screen in a very bold, big, red line item. Kids are always going to forget. Okay, we can remind them as often as possible, but this is what we need them to do. And you can take advantage of different communication methods to illustrate the message, but it's very clear at the moment: no copies, no expired documents, please. Unfortunately, we have a very caring and invested team here at the DOE who verifies our young people specifically. They're even separate from the human resources team. They care about our young people. They want to see them do the best, but they have to verify every single student from every single school that wants to get verified. And so their time is very precious. So when they register for an appointment, which we'll do I'll show you in a moment, please also remember them to show up early, because if they miss their appointment, they're going to have to sign up for a new one. So if I'm a student and I'm ready to get verified, I'm going to grab my documents from home. I'm going to get my working papers, no copies, no expired. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I filled out my I-9 page 1. This document is a few pages, but students only complete page 1, which is a common misconception for our youth. They would indicate the information shown here. Most of it should be something they can answer on their own without any assistance. But again, this is where, it would require them to identify their particular information and sign it. If they don't sign it and show it to the verifier, again, we're providing, they're providing a barrier for themselves. If we've gotten to this point and young people are ready to get verified, there are 2 general processes for doing this. The general process is to meet one of our wonderful verifiers, some of who are listed here on the screen, and use their appropriate Calendly link to register for that appointment. Students will be asked to select a date and time for their 5-minute appointment. So again, they should be ready in advance. And when they pick that time, in which they range, there's some in the early morning, there's some in the late afternoon, there's even some during the day. Students will be asked to identify their information, so they get a calendar invite. That way, if they're not in the appointment, they can be resent the link via email. But also, you or a designee at the school will also be identified, so you know that this person is signed up for an appointment, so you can reach in and help them. So that way they are prepared and ready to go. If a student has successfully brought their documents, they meet one of these wonderful individuals and get verified, the verifier will tell them so. And you will be able to determine whether or not a student is verified by looking at their Career Pathway Portals account. You'll be able to see that page 1, the thing that the student has to submit, and page 2, the document that the verifier submits, are both uploaded to their account, which would effectively mean that they are verified for that wage-based internship. The last thing that I'll say here is that I-9 verification is based on the employer in this specific circumstance. And so any opportunity paid through the Career Pathways portal would mean the exact same employer. So if a student gets I-9 verified in 9th grade, September of 9th grade, they don't have to get verified ever again for the purposes of the Department of Education for the City of New York in the Career Pathways portal. If they do something like Summer Youth Employment Program, SYEP, or they do something external, like paid by a museum, they're going to have to do I-9 verification with those people. A misconception is that when we tell kids, you only got to do it once, and then you never have to do it again, that comes with the caveat that you only have to do it once for the same employer. And although we try to give young people this reminder or this note, it does not always stick. So checking in with youth, looking up their accounts and saying, hey, are you verified, is all part of the process as well. Are there any additional clarifications or questions? Well, y'all have been a fantastic audience. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this information with you. Feel free again to reach out to any of the district users on the call or myself if you have any additional clarification questions. And this is a great time right now. Here in November, I would even say going back to October and September are even better, to make it part of your annual process at your school to getting youth verified as early as possible. Every school community is different. Their strategies will change. However, it's certainly a good idea to get young people verified. And that can be a lesson that they do in class as part of learning of how to get ready. And it's also just an adult process that we all have to do no matter what when we graduate. So I'll turn it back on over to Desmond, and I'll be around in case there's any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Damiano. Appreciate you as always. And I like the new haircut. You know what I'm saying? Thought I had noticed. Good cut, man. Anyway, yeah, so thank you. Let me pause the recording. Once again, we don't have, well, just wanted to thank you guys for joining us because there were some folk who actually had trouble getting in. The recording is, once everything is process, the recording will be shared out. So, just await the email. And if you have any additional questions, please just remember to reach out to myself, to Alicia, or any other member of the